Chris Hensley is a registered representative of Cambridge Investment Research, Inc., a broker-dealer member of FINRA SIPC, investment advisor representative of Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, Inc., a registered investment advisor. Cambridge and Houston First Financial Group are not affiliated.
For many marketing professionals, science is a four-letter word. They see brand building as an unteachable art guided by their intuition and experience. But at its core, marketing aims to seed ideas into people's minds, make them feel a certain way, and ultimately get them to act. In Brand Seduction, author Daryl Weber reveals the latest psychological and neuroscientific discoveries about how our minds process brand information and make decisions, and the important roles our emotions and unconscious play in our selections. So please stay tuned. Keep listening. Daryl will be joining us very, very shortly to do a deep dive into brand seduction, how neuroscience can help marketers build a more memorable brand. But if you are a long-time listener, you do know that we always reserve the first few moments of the show to tell you a little bit about what's going on in the financial literacy space here in Houston and in the Gulf Coast region. So we are right here at the end of the summer, and typically there's a kind of a slowdown around this time, but that is not the case right now. We have on the financial literacy front, we've got a talk tomorrow at the Youngman Library at 10:15, and this is in regards to optional retirement programs. So this is the state pension for teachers, for state employees who have the option between TRS or optional retirement programs. So this is a free seminar that is open to the public at 10:15 tomorrow at the Youngman Library. Also, coming up in September, we're going to go out and have a talk at One Subsea LLC about managing retirement risk. Now, this one is not open to the public. It is just open to employees of One Subsea. It's free. There is food involved with it, but we were going to be focusing on managing retirement risk. That's going to be on 9/6/2017. So if you know somebody that works at One Subsea. Separate from that, on the 12th of September, we will be out at the Department of Health talking about understanding credit. And so that one is free and open to employees of the City of Houston Department of Health, but it is closed just to the employees of that organization. So if you know people who are employed at those two organizations, One Subsea or the City of Houston Department of Health, let them know, get the word out, and let them know that these talks are available to them. Separate from that, we are still involved with Houston Money Week, which I know it's kind of early to be talking about this because we're here still in 2017, and Houston Money Week doesn't take place until April of 2018. However, I'm part of the leadership team. As part of the leadership team, we have already started meeting and started planning. We have a milestone coming up in 2018, and that is going to be our 10th year anniversary. And so we are very, very excited about getting ramped up and started on this. If you have not heard, Houston Money Week is a nonprofit, for-profit, city government initiative to bring financial literacy to the moderate income, low income, really any Houstonians that are interested in financial literacy, tax preparation, anything along those lines. In April, we kick off a citywide event with free financial literacy classes on many, many different topics. In fact, I would point you to their website, houstonmoneyweek.org, because you can actually put your zip code in there and it will pull up any of these free events that are local to you. Or if you're specifically looking for a certain topic, you can go in and look at it that way. If you would like to become involved as an individual, as a volunteer, or even as an organization, if you are president of an organization, or maybe you know the human resource manager of a company, or a professional association, anything like that that would like to become involved with HoustonMoneyWeek.org, this is the time. We are now getting ramped up, and I would highly recommend getting on the website and taking a look at that. With that, let's go ahead and get Daryl on the line. Daryl, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, I always like to start the show kind of the same way by sharing a little bit about you. Now, you're the author of the book that we mentioned earlier, Brand Seduction, How Neuroscience Can Help Marketers Build Memorable Brands. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, yeah. So I'm a branding consultant. I've worked at sort of advertising agencies in New York and brand strategy consultancies. But then recently moved down to Atlanta. I was the global director of creative strategy at the Coca-Cola Company. So kind of moved over to the client side and ran sort of brand strategy and communication strategy for many of their brands globally. I did that for a few years, but then left to write this book, Brand Seduction. Really, because I was always fascinated by how the mind works, and saw this big gap between how marketers think consumers' minds work and how they actually do, and how sort of neuroscientists and psychologists talked about it. So I wanted to write that book to kind of help bridge that gap. It came out last year, and since then I've been sort of consulting related to sort of the unconscious side of brands and brand strategy for many different clients.
So that was one of the things I was going to ask you is why did you write the book? But it sounds like you were motivated by your experience that you saw this gap out there. Let's kind of dive right into that. What are some of the surprising unconscious side of brands that you found when you wrote the book?
Yeah, well, sort of the biggest myth out there is that consumers are rational and that we understand the decisions that we make and why we make them. You see this in focus groups all the time when marketers do market research, and we bring consumers together and we try to ask them why they buy something or why they like something, and typically, it's very hard, actually, for us to know why we do the things we do. And what scientists are realizing is that there's all these unconscious processes that are going on below the surface that we aren't really aware of that influence our decisions and how we relate to brands and the choices we make. And we're just, starting to get a better sense of that. But scientists have known for a long time that that's been the case. And so that was kind of the biggest illusion out there, that consumers are sort of consciously aware of these things, and marketers were trying to market to the conscious mind of the consumers. And I think that misses a vast array of different influences that are going on below the surface. And that's really what I wanted to expose in this book, is how we can just be smarter about our marketing and how we build our brands if we better understand those unconscious processes.
Absolutely. So these are the things that you may not think about that are just kind of under the surface when we make decisions. You also talk about emotions in building brands. What is the real role of emotions in building brands?
Yeah, so emotions have become a really hot topic with marketers these days. I think marketing has kind of evolved over the past few decades, where originally, it was very much about the functions of products, what they do for you, how they're different from the competition. But as most products have really become comparable in terms of function, really anyone can be copied and copy the functional benefits of a product, they had to go beyond just functional benefits and talk more about emotional benefits, and that's how they could differentiate, right? So even if two products are the same, you maybe have a stronger emotional connection to one over the other, which I think is still true. And I think marketers maybe took that a little too literally lately, and maybe a little too far. You see many brands these days putting out ads that seem like they're trying to make you cry, no matter what the ad is, whether it's for soap or orange juice or anything. They're playing soft piano music and showing some really touching story, and it's getting you to cry by the end of it, right? I think that's actually too literal of interpretation of emotions and the role they play in decision making. There's actually a whole unconscious side of emotions, and this is the world of sort of intuition and gut feeling. And these are very sort of subtle things that we may not even be aware of or notice, but that actually have profound impacts on how we go through life and decide to do things and what we choose to buy. And so I try to, through the book, show how emotions can work at that unconscious level as well, and where those emotions come from and how they guide our decision making. There's some great neuroscientists who have done a lot of work in this area over the past few decades. But this isn't really like new science or just one study. I'm talking about pretty well-established science, at least in some areas. Of course, there's a lot we don't know about the brain. But in many of these areas, we do have a pretty good sense for how we pick up these different interpretations of brands and feelings towards them, and those subtly kind of shift and guide our behavior in ways we may not even realize.
I love that you mentioned kind of the emotions there, and you talked about some people taking it too far to the literal interpretation of the emotions. I think of the Pepsi can commercial fiasco recently, where it is kind of if they're just attempting to pull your heartstrings, and it's a kind of transparent effort, you're going the wrong direction with it. But what you're talking about is something even more deeper than that, some of these unconscious things that go into the marketing. As an entrepreneur or a business owner, what things can we take from this to help us decode or build on these principles?
Yeah, that Pepsi example, I think, is another example of a mistake a lot of, especially big marketers, tend to make, which is they overestimate the importance of their brand in consumers' lives. And they think their brand can do these really grandiose, sort of lofty things like, stop a protest or change sort of big fundamental issues in the world. Which clearly they can't. And I think, that was Pepsi just overstepping their bounds there, again, trying to make this big emotional connection, but not understanding the real role that these brands play in their lives and the true sort of nature of the relationship consumers have with brands. More practically speaking, for business owners, I think there's a few things they can keep in mind. One, what I alluded to earlier, is just when you are talking to customers and trying to understand how your brand or product or service relates to marketers, remember that what they might be telling you on the surface may not be the whole story. So you try to have to dig between the lines a little bit and understand what are their true motivations, what's going on in their lives, how can you kind of connect to their sort of core values and needs and beliefs and wants, maybe that they're not even aware of or they're not really saying. And that's a bit of an art. It's a bit tricky. There's something called projective techniques in qualitative research that help you kind of get below the surface, things like collage building, where you ask consumers to put together different images that are a bit more abstract and less literal, and that can get to sort of the feeling of a brand or a category or why they use your products, and that can actually be a really rich territory and something you can build off of as you build your brand. Another thing I'll say is in communications, I think marketers tend to overemphasize the conscious, rational message that they're telling people. They'll put a message out there and they want people to hear it, pay attention to it, and play it back to them, ideally word for word, right? And I think that's usually asking too much for people, and most people will kind of tune out advertising messages or ignore them. But advertising actually works at a much more subtle, subliminal level as well. I'm not talking about subliminal advertising, but actually any ad will have this other level of communication that's going on. It's referred to as meta communication. So there's the conscious message that you say and you focus on, but then this meta communication is more the tone of voice. It's how you say something. It's the personality and the mood and the vibe that you impart. And that can actually be very important. And scientists are showing that even if you didn't pay attention to the message, even if you don't even realize you saw it, like if you drive past a billboard on the highway, you might forget completely that you ever saw that billboard. But the feeling you got from it, even if you just briefly glanced at it, sort of the font they use or the way the model is looking or the smile on her face, or the lighting, all those things can impart a feeling that connects to that brand, and those things can actually seep into your subconscious, even if you didn't realize it, and change subtly your perception of a brand. So say you pass a fashion brand on a billboard on a highway like that, someone asks you if you saw an ad for it, you might say no, but maybe in your unconscious now your perception of that brand is now subtly shifted to be a bit more modern or hip or younger, depending on how they showed it. So understanding that meta communication and what your tone of voice and your style, what that's communicating, is actually very powerful and really influences how people connect and relate to brands. So I would say, don't just focus on that conscious message, but also be clear on what your meta communication is saying as well, and the personality of your brand.
How does one do that? Because this sounds really, that when you talk about the feeling and the tone, and the message. I remember when I was in high school, I had a business law class where we went into business psychology, and they showed, this was a long time ago, but they showed pictures where advertisers would put little messages kind of airbrushed in the background. Well, we're not necessarily talking about that. We're talking about kind of a feel or the meta communication, meta message. How do you test for that? How do you decode that, I guess?
Yeah, it's not as sort of scientific and easy to test for and uncover. But you're right. I'm not talking about hidden messages or subliminal messages. I'm just talking about the feeling imparted from any advertising or communication you do. So one way to think about it is just to be more strategic about it and try to think ahead of time. What do I want my brand to feel like? Even, beyond what people will say about it, what sort of mood do I want to impart? What's my personality? And you can think of it like a person. In the way that we dress ourselves says something about us, whether you want it to or not, right? However you dress, or however you hold yourself, or however your tone of voice and nonverbal communication, all that says something about yourself. And you can actually try to think, do I want my brand to feel, maybe it's academic or cool and trendy or innovative or warm and soft and fluffy. You can kind of like try to, what's going to be differentiating in my category and connect to my consumers, and try to, plan that up front. So it's not just left to designers or copywriters or art directors or whoever might be sort of creating the ads. They might just do it by feel, but you can actually give them that clear direction and say, here's what I think my brand needs to feel like to differentiate in my category and to connect with my consumers in the right way. And then once you have those ads or communications developed, you can actually talk to consumers and try to tease out, what does my brand feel like? You can do some of those projective techniques I mentioned. Another one is sort of persona building, where you talk about your brand as if it were a person and have them describe what the personality traits of that person would be. And you can kind of get a feel for how they relate to your brand on a deeper level beyond what that conscious message is.
So I love that, because as an entrepreneur, this is really, you're not leaving your kind of corporate culture, corporate message out there to come to fruition on its own. You're defining it as a planner up front. You're saying, this is how I want this to feel, and so you're able to kind of plan around it as you get that message out there. You talked about things like talking to your clients, persona building. You also mentioned earlier different projective techniques that you can use to do this. What about things even as simple as surveys or surveying your clients? Is that something that you think is a good thing? Or
yeah, you can definitely use quantitative data like that, like surveys. They're very obviously easy and cheap to run. You have to be careful with what you get back when you're trying to expose these sort of different brand elements, because like I said, it's a bit of an art. You have to read between the lines a little bit, but certain measures can definitely be helpful. A few I like to use related to this sort of a brand feeling, brand personality type thing is the idea of trust, and talking about you can kind of ask people what level of trust they have for your brand and give them sort of a sliding scale. Or identity, you can ask people, is this a brand for me? And that usually gives you a good sense of if they sort of relate to the brand, if they see themselves in it, if it's something aspirational to them. Because brands, work as kind of a badge. They're something you want to connect yourself to and how you see yourself. So you kind of ask some questions like that and see where your brand fits along those spectrums. Another one is, would you recommend this to others? Would you introduce this brand to others? And maybe how would you describe it to others? That can show you also how proud they are to show your brand and share it with others, because of course that gives them some social currency for introducing it, and it shows something about themselves. So all those kind of can get at different layers, rather than asking about your brand directly and do they like this or what do they think of it, it kind of gives you a different angle to look at them in a way and gets a bit deeper.
So definitely interesting things that you mentioned there. Trust between you and the client, the identity. Would you recommend this brand to others? When I had mentioned the surveys earlier, you said that they may not be telling you the whole story, so there has to be kind of a caveat there that you be purposeful in what you are asking and maybe take it with a grain of salt. I want to kind of sidestep just a little bit, because one of the things that I wanted to talk about, and I don't want to go too far into politics, but if you think about branding and even something like the president, like Trump, that's one of the things we mentioned in emails there. Might you share your perspective on kind of the Trump brand or branding and how it relates to that?
Yeah, so, a lot's obviously been written and talked about with his rise, and, obviously there was many factors to why he won the campaign, so I don't want to oversimplify it. But one thing that I think is interesting that I don't hear brought up as much is sort of how there's a an unconscious level to the Trump brand itself. And I think it was actually built up over many years and sort of his decades in the spotlight and in the sort of national conversation. So if you think of, he was on the cover of Playboy, and sort of you've seen the name Trump written in these gold letters at the top of big buildings. Those things, and even the word Trump, right? It kind of means, the best in sort of card games, right? And it's the top, and the fact that he always used it to be this sort of always in gold and very fancy and detailed, like all those things. Even if you weren't paying attention to him, I think they were seeping into the national subconscious and collectively giving you this feeling that idea of Trump, the name, the brand, stands for the best. Maybe some people see it as cheesy or gaudy, but for some people it definitely felt like the top, right? The pinnacle, the success. And I think that gave him a huge leg up. I mean, even just the word Trump, like I said, but where you've seen the name, and then of course in his shows, being the Apprentice and the Celebrity Apprentice, showing him in the boardroom, being the leader there, being sort of tough talker, all those things before his campaign even started, before he ever announced, were part of his subconscious brand that felt, it embodied sort of success and businessman and business owner, and I think there's a lot of sort of attractive qualities in there that were just built into it really over decades, right? And once you have that kind of brand association built over that long term of a period, it's very hard to shake it and change it. So almost regardless of what he said in the campaign and, many of the gaffes and things, it's very hard to change those neural networks, is how neuropsychologists would call it, that when you learn something, and your brain actually changes, and the neurons in your brain will actually form different networks. So physically, in the brain, there's a representation of what Trump stands for, and because it's been reinforced and built in all these ways over so many years, once it's built in the brain, it's very hard to change it. And so he already had this pretty strong subconscious brand to stand on and build on, and I think that kind of gave him a leg up and a start, and what a lot of people attracted to him initially, regardless of what he then said in the campaign. So I think that played a large part in it.
Absolutely. So this is, I'm not a big fan of Trump, but when we if we put politics aside for a moment and we look at and we talk about the neuroscience behind it, you've made some very interesting points. You talked about him, even before getting out of the gate, his name, his brand existed. There's almost a social proof or showing credibility if you think of things like The Apprentice, and that these have been out there. His name on the top of the building, the cover of Playboy, all of these things had already been pre-built in prior to him even getting out of the gate and running for office. And so one of the points that you're making is that when there's a brand out there, your brain actually changes in a sense that those images, those symbols kind of get reinforced with the brand, kind of discounting other stuff that's going on. There's stuff that's already put out there. Very good example and very, very interesting on that. Going back to from a business owner stance, when we talk about building on these, what can one do with these principles to implicate or to bring this into kind of a entrepreneurial marketing?
Yeah, there's a couple lessons I think you could learn. So when I'm talking about those neural networks, we have these neural networks for basically everything we encounter, and they're constantly sort of shifting and shaping as we learn and grow and have new experiences. But one thing is to recognize the worldview of the people you're trying to target and speak to. Because that's basically the neural networks that they already have imprinted in their brains. And like I said, it's hard to change those. So it's better to sort of acknowledge them and work with them. So if you're trying to, position some kind of new service or product or brand, even if it's totally new, you don't want to talk about it in such a differentiating way, because novelty can be a bit scary, and then it's hard for people to sort of grasp what it is, right? So you want to anchor it in something familiar and something they know and something that fits with their current neural networks and their current worldview, and then maybe show the shift or show what's different about it, right? I see sometimes people who think they have this great new idea and it's so exciting to them, and they focus on what's different. But that can actually be hard for the brain to process unless you anchor it in something that they already know and are familiar with. So, show them the familiar, show them how this fits into whatever mental bucket they might already have, but then, show them the evolution and the advancement and how you've made it better, rather than just making a whole new mental bucket, essentially, right? That's a trap I think some, especially entrepreneurs, fall into when they overemphasize the differences of their brand rather than linking it back to something they know. That's just people will be more receptive to that. They'll understand your message much easier. And when we're talking about advertising, you have very little time and people are putting very little effort to try to understand your message. So make sure it's anchored in something familiar, and the message will come across much more simply and easily.
So the idea of anchoring your idea to something else, is that can you go a little bit further into that? For somebody who's not familiar with the term anchoring, can you tell us a little bit more about how would one go about doing that? Sure,
and I should be clear. Anchoring has a specific meaning in behavioral economics, where you can anchor people in a number. If you're in a negotiation and you say a number first, that number, whatever it is, will anchor people and shift their perception and judgment about any future number. So if you anchor people high or low. So actually what I'm talking about maybe is better, more precisely referred to as framing. Mm-hmm. So the frame and the context that you put around your message and the subject will influence how people see your brand or perception. So I'm trying to think of an example, but say you have a new service or product, be very clear about what context and what frame you put around it so that people say, okay, I get roughly what you're talking about, and now I see how you're different. So start broad and make sure you're grounding it in something that people already know, and that'll just make the on-ramp and your message just go on much more smoothly than if you just try to boldly say something different.
So I would say that the bulk of everything that we're talking about is being conscious of these things and making them into a positive. When you were researching the book, did you come across any companies that might have used the same type of tactics for anything that you would consider negative?
You mean to negatively advertise, like against competitors or something?
I guess that would be one of the examples. Sure.
No, I mean, in general, actually, I recommend not to do negative advertising against competitors because you tend to bring up their associations, and if people are not paying too much attention, you're actually reinforcing your competitor's brand often without meaning it to. So you see brands, try to maybe hide the fact or not mention their competitor by name or things, but even doing that can still subtly bring up those the representations and activate the neural networks for your competitor's brand. So actually, going back to the Trump example, Hillary Clinton's campaign, they had a line or a hashtag that was trending for a while called "Love Trump's Hate." And, it seems kind of clever, but the fact that they're using the word Trump in there is actually activating Trump again. You're building your brand in relation to the other brand. And I think that's not smart to do. But, it would have been better for her to stand on something on her own, not in context with Trump, not related to Trump, because she's still activating his frames and his neural networks. And, that doesn't build a strong case for yourself on its own.
I'm kind of giggling here. Growing up in the 80s, I think of the cola wars where, Pepsi versus Coke, and one of them they would do a commercial where they would bring the competitor in. And yeah, it's like, don't think about that. And of course, the first thing you're going to think about is that other thing. So it's hard to do that. Well, interesting. See, I love this topic. We could talk about this for days. I do a lot about consumer finance and personal finance, and when people walk into the grocery store, I feel like they're at war with the advertisers sometimes. So, we are bumping towards the end of the show here. Is there anything that you'd like to share with our listeners that I forgot to ask you about today?
I'd say just overall, when you think about building a brand and marketing a product or service, you got to remember it's much more than just the marketing itself. It's not just the marketing department who's building the brand, because any touch point that a consumer has with your brand or your company is going to influence that sort of subtle subconscious gut feeling they have towards your brand and company. So things like your distribution, your pricing, but even your customer service, how they receive your product in the mail, the packaging, all these really little things that maybe don't seem like part of brand building and marketing, they're all influencing and shaping that perception people have of your brand and the associations that they connect with your brand. And those will get linked to your brand in their subconscious, and they're pretty durable, and they stay in memory. So really think of your whole business as building the brand. Everything you do as a company should be part of building the brand.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Money Matters Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, visit us on the web at www.moneymatterspodcast.com. Drop us a line on SpeakPipe on the right-hand corner. It will receive any voicemails, questions, thoughts, concerns that you have about the show. In addition to this, we recently launched a Patreon campaign. Click on the Donate Now tab to hit the tip jar and find out what Patreon's campaign is all about.